it together. You know, every time I look over, that's my son, there's my boy. And so that never.
2 weeks before his death, Rob Reiner finally said the words he had spent decades avoiding. "I love my son, but I don't know how to save him." There was no anger in his voice, no bitterness, only exhaustion, the kind that comes from loving someone through years of fear, relapse, and unanswered prayers. Reiner, the man who built a career telling stories about hope, friendship, and redemption, was facing a reality no script could fix. His son was struggling. Again. For years, Rob believed patience would win, that love, consistency, and second chances would eventually break through. But as he spoke in that final interview, something had changed. His optimism was quieter, his hope more fragile. He knew time was running out. What makes this story heartbreaking isn't what happened after, but what Rob Reiner already understood before the end. This is not a Hollywood story. It's a father's confession and a warning too late. Rob Reiner had spent his entire life believing in structure. He believed that if you showed up every day, did the work, and stayed present, things would eventually turn out right. That belief shaped his career and guided the way he tried to be a father. Unlike many Hollywood parents, Rob was not distant. He didn't disappear into sets or fame. He was home. He listened. He stayed involved. From the outside, it looked like the ideal environment to raise a child. But inside that structure was an unspoken pressure no one talked about. Rob Reiner was not just a successful director, he was the son of Carl Reiner, one of the most respected figures in American comedy. Growing up in that shadow had taught Rob a quiet lesson. Expectations don't have to be spoken to be felt. When Rob became a father, he swore he would never pass that burden on. He promised himself his children would never feel measured against a legacy. They would be free to fail, free to choose, free to be ordinary if they wanted. What Rob didn't realize was that freedom without emotional clarity can still feel like distance. He gave his son space. He avoided pressure. He waited for the right moments to talk, moments that always seemed just around the corner. And slowly, without intention, silence began doing what Rob never wanted it to do. It grew. By the time he noticed something was wrong, the problem was no longer about discipline or guidance. It was about a child who had already learned how to disappear and a father who didn't yet understand what that disappearance meant. The first signs didn't arrive like a warning siren. They never do. When Rob Reiner noticed that something was wrong with his son, it wasn't rebellion, it wasn't anger, it was absence, missed calls, short answers, a distance that couldn't be measured in arguments, only in silence. Nick was barely 15 when alcohol entered his life. At first, it looked harmless, teenage curiosity, social pressure, a phase Rob assumed would pass. There were no dramatic confrontations, no obvious red flags that demanded immediate action. In a household built on patience and trust, Rob believed time would correct itself, but alcohol was only the beginning. Drugs followed quietly, slipping into Nick's life without spectacle. Cocaine, pills, substances that offered something Nick had been searching for but couldn't name. They did not make him loud or reckless. They made him still. For the first time, the noise inside his head, the weight of a famous last name, the unspoken comparisons, the feeling of never fully belonging went silent. That silence became addictive. Rob and his wife watched their son fade rather than fall. Nick didn't explode into chaos. He withdrew. Family dinners grew awkward. Eye contact disappeared. Conversations stayed on the surface. Every attempt to reach him seemed to arrive one step too late, as if he had already left the room emotionally before anyone realized he was gone. When the truth finally surfaced, it came with a crushing sense of guilt. Rob replayed every moment he had chosen, patience over confrontation, space over urgency. He wondered whether his fear of becoming an overbearing father had allowed something far more dangerous to grow unnoticed. Rehabilitation followed, then another, and another. Each time, Rob waited with cautious hope. Each return from treatment felt like a reset, a chance to start again, to believe that love had finally reached its target. For brief moments, Nick seemed present, engaged, alive, and Rob clung to those moments like proof that everything he believed in still mattered. But addiction does not honor hope. Relapses came without warning, sometimes weeks after treatment, sometimes months. Each one carved away a piece of Rob's optimism, replacing it with something heavier: vigilance. He learned how to read silence, how to fear late-night phone calls, how to brace himself for news he didn't want to imagine. There were darker chapters, periods when Nick disappeared entirely, nights when Rob didn't know where his son was sleeping or if he was safe at all, times when Nick was homeless, drifting between states, surviving on borrowed kindness and broken promises. Rob never stopped showing up. He answered calls at any hour. He wired money when he shouldn't have. He opened doors that therapists advised him to close. Friends warned him about enabling. Experts urged boundaries. Rob listened, but he couldn't fully comply. The idea of stepping back felt like abandonment, and abandonment was the one thing he had sworn his children would never feel. Eventually, exhaustion forced a decision he would later regret. Tough love. To -3. Following professional advice, Rob cut off financial support and insisted Nick enter treatment on his own terms. He believed consequences might succeed where patience had failed. Instead, it widened the emotional gap between them. Nick interpreted boundaries as rejection. Rob interpreted distance as necessity. Neither realized how deeply misunderstood they had become to each other. Years passed inside this cycle. 17 rehabilitation attempts, hospital visits, overdoses, a cocaine-induced heart attack mid-flight, episodes of rage that frightened even those who loved Nick most. Each crisis chipped away at Rob's sense of control, replacing it with a quiet, devastating truth. Love does not guarantee rescue. At some point, Rob learned to lower his expectations, not because he stopped caring, but because hope had become physically painful. He once admitted that he began hoping in smaller increments, days instead of futures, conversations instead of recoveries. Then came Being Charlie. On the surface, it looked like a film project. In reality, it was a last attempt at connection. Rob directed, Nick co-wrote. The story mirrored their lives too closely to ignore. A young addict, a famous father, and a relationship strained by fear, misunderstanding, and love that didn't know how to land. The process forced them into the same emotional space, not as parent and child, but as collaborators. There were arguments, long silences, moments where old wounds reopened. But there was also something new: honesty without correction. Rob stopped trying to fix. Nick stopped trying to hide. For a brief moment, it felt like progress, like understanding had finally arrived. But understanding is not the same as recovery. When filming ended, life resumed. The addiction remained. The cycle continued, and Rob was left facing the cruelest realization of all. He had reached the edge of what a parent could do. 2 weeks before his death, when Rob finally spoke publicly about his son, his words carried no drama, no accusation, just acceptance. He had stopped trying to sound hopeful. He spoke like a man who had already grieved outcomes he could not change. He loved his son. He believed in him. But he knew something was slipping beyond his reach. And somewhere inside that quiet confession was an understanding Rob never said out loud, but had lived with for years. The tragedy he feared was not sudden. It had been building patiently, silently, for a very long time. And what came next would prove that even the most devoted love can arrive too late to stop what has already been set in motion. In the final days of his life, Rob Reiner was quieter than usual. Those closest to him noticed it: not despair, not panic, but a deep, unsettling calm. He had stopped searching for answers, stopped believing that one more conversation, one more intervention, could change the direction already set in motion. What remained was love stripped of illusion. When he spoke about his son, his voice carried no judgment, only acceptance. He understood, finally, that some battles cannot be won by persistence alone. 2 weeks later, Rob Reiner was gone, and the words he left behind no longer sounded like fear. They sounded like farewell. After Rob Reiner's death, many focused on his legacy, the films, the awards, the cultural impact. But those closest to him understood that his final years were defined not by success, but by endurance. Rob had lived long enough to recognize a painful truth. There are tragedies that do not arrive as shocks. They arrive slowly, through repetition, through cycles that wear down certainty until only acceptance remains. He had spent years asking himself the same question every parent in his position asks: what else could I have done? And had never found an answer that brought peace. What haunted him most was not the addiction itself, but the possibility that his son might believe he was unloved. That silence, meant to avoid pressure, may have felt like distance, that boundaries meant to protect may have felt like rejection. Rob carried that fear quietly, long before he ever spoke it aloud. In his final reflections, he never blamed his son. He blamed circumstance, timing, the invisible weight of expectations passed down through generations. He understood how easily pain could hide behind privilege, and how difficult it was to recognize suffering when it didn't announce itself loudly. For Rob Reiner, the greatest lesson came too late to change anything, but not too late to matter. Love, he realized, is not only about staying, it is about being understood while you stay. His story does not end with resolution. There is no redemption arc, no final victory over darkness. What remains instead is something quieter and more honest, a reminder that even the most devoted parents have limits, and that guilt often survives long after hope has faded. In the end, Rob Reiner's final confession was not a warning about addiction alone. It was a warning about silence, about waiting too long to say what matters, and about the cost of believing there will always be more time. Some stories don't end with closure. They end with understanding and the ache of realizing it came just a little too late.